Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to tackle a huge myth that you see all the time in science and public policy, this idea that there's one single best kind of evidence. We're going to explore a much smarter, more flexible way to think about what it really means when studies show something. Okay, let's get into it.
So, just for a second, imagine you're a policymaker. You're getting hit with really tough questions every single day, questions that affect millions of people. You have to make the right call, which means you need solid evidence. But what does good evidence even look like?
For instance, you might get asked this. This is a classic public health debate that's been going on for decades. Do you have the right evidence to make a decision one way or the other? And how confident can you be in that evidence? Or maybe the question is about social policy. You know, there's this popular idea that getting tough on crime will scare kids straight, but does it actually work? The stakes for the young people involved are just incredibly high.
And how about this one? I mean, it seems like a total no-brainer, right? Of course you install smoke alarms. But can we prove that they actually cause the outcome we want? Answering any of these questions is a massive, difficult task. So how on earth do decision-makers sort through all the research out there?
Well, for a long time, the answer has been to use this thing, the hierarchy of evidence. You can think of it as the traditional rulebook for judging scientific studies. And the idea behind it is actually pretty straightforward. This hierarchy just ranks different kinds of studies based on how good they are at avoiding bias. The higher you go on the hierarchy, the more trustworthy the result is supposed to be.
And this pyramid is what it usually looks like. Down at the bottom, you've got things like individual case reports. But as you climb up, the study designs get more and more rigorous at filtering out bias, until you get to the very top, the so-called gold standard, which are randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. And, of course, systematic reviews that pull all those RCTs together.
But here's the thing. What if this nice, neat pyramid isn't always the right tool for the job? What if by relying on it, we're actually missing the bigger picture? Let's take a look at where this seemingly perfect structure starts to show some really serious cracks.
The first problem is just empirical. The whole assumption is that this ranking is set in stone. An RCT is always better than, say, an observational study. But, recent research has started to poke holes in that idea. It turns out that some really well-designed observational studies can actually give you results that are incredibly close to what you'd get from a so-called gold standard RCT. So the idea that one is always better is getting a lot harder to defend. But honestly, that squabble over the ranking isn't even the biggest issue. The most important flaw in relying only on this hierarchy is that it's really only built to answer one very specific type of question. Does this thing work?
And this quote from back in 1997 just absolutely nails it. We get so caught up squabbling over what the quote-unquote best method is when we should be focusing on the question we're trying to answer. The research method has to serve the question, not the other way around.
Now let me give you a classic example to make this real. It's been nearly 150 years since a doctor named Semmelweis did a trial showing that hand-washing by doctors dramatically cuts down on infections and deaths in hospitals. So we have rock-solid, gold standard evidence that hand-washing is effective. The hierarchy did its job, right? But it can't answer this question. If we know it works, why is it still so hard to get all healthcare workers to do it consistently? An RCT can't tell you about human behavior or workplace culture. For that, you need a totally different kind of evidence. And that brings us to a much more powerful way of looking at this. It's about ditching this single, rigid ladder of evidence and instead picking up a flexible toolbox. It's about creating what are called typologies.
The whole idea is captured perfectly in this old saying, horses for courses, right? You wouldn't use a thoroughbred racehorse to plow a field, and you wouldn't enter a giant draft horse in the Kentucky Derby. You need the right horse for the right course. And it's the exact same idea with research. We need the right method for the right question.
And that is precisely what a typology is. It's not a ranking. It's a framework for matching. So instead of asking, what's the best evidence? We start asking, what's the best evidence for this particular question? It's a way more useful and, frankly, smarter way of thinking.
Okay, so this all sounds good in theory, right? A toolbox, not a ladder. But what does that actually look like when you put it to work? Let's get out of the abstract and look at a tool that shows how powerful this approach can be.
All right, check out this evidence matrix. On the left, you've got different kinds of questions, and across the top, you have different research methods. Now, if your question is about effectiveness, does it work? Then, yep, RCTs and systematic reviews are your best friends. They get 3 pluses. But look what happens when we change the question. If you want to know about the process, as in how does it work, or about acceptability, will people actually use this thing? All of a sudden, qualitative research shoots to the top. That becomes your new gold standard.
And that, right there, is the big aha moment. There is no single best method that works for everything. The best kind of evidence changes completely depending on the question you're trying to answer. It's not about which method is number one all the time. It's about which method is the right one for the right job right now.
So when you boil it all down, this is really about a fundamental shift in how we think about evidence. Instead of always trying to climb to the top of a single pyramid, we need to get really good at picking the right tool from the toolbox for the job at hand.
So let's just quickly recap the main ideas. First, trying to force everything into a single hierarchy of evidence just doesn't work that well for complex public health problems. Second, thinking in terms of typologies or toolboxes is a much more helpful way to see the unique strengths and weaknesses of every method. And finally, using a matrix like the one we just saw is a practical way to help us match the right tool to the right job every single time.
So I'm going to leave you with this. The next time you see a news headline or you hear someone say, well, studies show, you're now armed with a much more powerful lens. Instead of just accepting it or asking how good the evidence is, maybe the first and most important question to ask is this: what question was that study actually designed to answer in the first place? Thanks for watching.